Mm.
Well, good evening and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM News Talk Radio. Well, I've got a treat for you tonight. I've got Elizabeth May, the leader of the Green Party, one of the people that I've really enjoyed listening to over the years. From her home in somewhere on the West Coast, I think outside of Victoria, British Columbia. And she's going to tell us sort of what her perception is of what's going on. So Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thanks, Brian. I should tell people where I live. It's a little town called Sydney by the sea. My riding is Saanich Gulf Island. So I'm here on the very, very southernmost tip of Vancouver Island. Well, Victoria's further to the south, but I'm on the Saanich Peninsula. And I've been spending much more time in my apartment than I have usually. It's actually, I suppose, when I got back from Ottawa after we shut down on March 13th for public safety reasons. And I was self-isolating for 14 days because I knew in Parliament I'd been exposed to lots of people who had themselves been exposed to COVID-19. So I wanted to be very careful. But it was, I suppose, about 3 or 4 days into being shut down before I realized I don't need to keep my suitcase out because I'm constantly repacking and going somewhere within a day, right? Because the normal schedule for a member of Parliament, and it's a different schedule. Your work as a member of Parliament is physically different if you're a member of Parliament from British Columbia than if you're a member of Parliament from the GTA, in that you've got 3-hour time zone difference, that you're getting home usually on a Friday evening, leaving Sunday afternoon back to Ottawa. So again, the ever-present suitcase in the room, in and out, back and forth. When I put that away, I realized it sort of hit home that everything was very different, and I wasn't leaving my apartment for 14 days.
So in some ways, this time in Sydney must be relaxing for you.
It hasn't been so far because the workload has increased so much. So my husband, who's here with me, fortunately, because he's doing the at very safe social distance, doing what essential shopping we need and so on. He notes that I really don't stop work because of being in BC time zone. If I get up and start work at 7 a.m., which of course is reasonable, but that's already 10 a.m. in Ottawa, so I'm already behind times to catch up. I try to watch the Prime Minister's press conference every day to stay on top of any recent announcements, and then I have good access to anyone within government. All the MPs, I think opposition MPs, are noting that we can reach out and talk to the ministers, cabinet ministers, fairly easily, not every minute, every day, but I've been in touch very frequently by text and email and phone with just about every member of cabinet. And my colleague, Jenica Atwin, who is the member of Parliament for Fredericton and Green, and Paul Manley, who's Green from Nanaimo Ladysmith, all of us are finding, the other day Jenica was reporting in our little morning caucus calls how good the conversation was that she'd had with Harjit Sajjan. And she was saying, I've never had a personal briefing from the Minister of Defense before, but Jenica's riding Fredericton is very close to the military base there at Camp Gagetown. So there's a lot that's happening now. And then of course the workload isn't just the talking to other members of cabinet. It's for me, the most stressful has been families and individual Canadians stranded overseas. So in the last 2 weeks, close to 8,000 Canadians have been brought home. Now I've had constituents on cruise ships that weren't allowed to dock places. And in those kinds of conversations, you can imagine I'm talking to their family here in Canada and the constituents, often, at sea, and talking to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. I mean, the diplomatic effort, I don't know Canadians wouldn't think this, but to get a cruise ship that wasn't expected to go through the Panama Canal, it was supposed to dock, say, as the MS Marina was supposed to. It was supposed to have docked easily earlier in March in Lima, Peru. Lima said no. So then they go to Santiago, Chile. Santiago, Chile says no. Then you have to figure out, can we get them to Florida? Well, can we get them through the Panama Canal? That took the UK government, the US government, and the Canadian government in diplomacy with Panama Panama had labor unions through the Panama Canal saying, we don't think it's safe to let that cruise ship through. I mean, every single one of these issues engages people, high level, local, and then you add to that, if you've got any health issues with constituents, I pray to God right now, just about right this minute, I've got a family of 4 from Salt Spring Island making their way to the airport in Delhi, where after the last 3 weeks of trying to get them out, it looks like they I don't want to say too much. I'm so nervous to get them out because their little girl has been sick. She's 11. She doesn't have COVID-19 symptoms, but she needs to get home. So these issues have meant that I haven't relaxed at all. I've been trying to figure out, when can I take a day and not be like 24/7. I've got these 2 Blackberries, one Parliament of Canada, one Green Party. Between the 2 Blackberries and the laptop on which I'm talking to you and my landline, yesterday I had a moment where I was on a landline on the finance committee meeting, and on my Blackberry I was talking to, I won't say which minister, but I was talking to one of the cabinet ministers, because it was the only time I could get to talk to them about something that has impacts on my community. So all I can say is I haven't relaxed yet, and I really am looking forward to when we get all of my constituents. I like to say when we get everybody home who wants to get home, and then we get through whatever. Right now we also have the real panic for. I mean, so many Canadians aren't covered by the relief programs. Not yet.
There's no question.
Yeah. So
well,
anyway,
I've always
Brian,
thought
a sense of it. It's not relaxing yet. I'm glad.
I've always thought of you as one of the most energetic and active members of Parliament. And so for you to say that you're even busier than usual has got to be unbelievable. Anyway, we're going to take a quick break for messages and come back more with Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party, in just a minute. Stay with us.
Okay.
Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960 AM. We're chatting with Elizabeth May, the leader of the Green Party, from her home somewhere on the West Coast in Sydney, I think you said. Well, it's a pleasure to chat with you. Let me just ask, if I could, what do you think about our public health response? There's been a lot of criticism in the United States TV of President Trump's response and different governors that have had very different strategies. There doesn't seem to have been that kind of partisanship or criticism in Canada. Is that because they're doing a great job, or is that because we're nicer Canadians, or someone told me the other day we're more of a Team Canada kind of attitude? What do you think of our public health response in Canada?
Well, I do want to give a shout out for the Team Canada attitude. I mean, we were talking in the first segment about working round the clock. I have to say, I'm not the only one doing that. I had the remarkable experience last weekend. I was helping a local business that wants to expand. And believe it or not, as COVID-19 occupies everything and everything's about emergency response, at the same time, some of the existing government programs have timelines. Like if you don't get this application in and you've got 30 days. So I wanted to make sure an application for some business investment had been noticed in an office called the Western Diversification Office, which is within Melanie Joly's. Anyway, so I wrote Melanie Joly, who's cabinet minister. She, of course, this is on a Saturday. She writes back and says, "I want to make sure the department notices the proposal from the company," and you write that up. So that I'm not so surprised, because Melanie Joly, like me, is on her Blackberry, and we know each other's personal addresses, and we're emailing each other. But what amazed me was that a bureaucrat, I'm not pejorative in the way I use the term, but a civil servant, on a Sunday, it was the next day, wrote back to say, "We know about this application, we're on it, we're trying to arrange a phone call with a..." And then I realized, okay, so it's not just the politically elected people who are working around the clock because we see the emergency. The entire civil service
is working around the clock as well.
Is in overdrive and extraordinarily working from home. Yeah. So quite often we'll have briefings from government officials and we'll be asking questions on the technicalities of the public health information. And in the background, you're talking to a public health expert and you hear their kid in the background, and okay, they, like all of us, are, goodness knows what they're juggling right now.
I have to tell you, I had the most, I think, heartwarming exchange. I was interviewing Andrea Horwath, the leader of the New Democratic Party in Ontario, and she had to cut in. She said, "Oh, my spaghetti sauce is boiling over," and she got up in the middle of the interview to stir her spaghetti sauce. Which, you know, she's a wonderful person, but you sort of don't get the opportunity to see people in their real environment and having
Well,
spaghetti
that's right.
sauce boil over.
Yeah, exactly. So what I would say is, I mean, there will be a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking, even in Canada, about did we act quickly enough? I go back in my head. I did an interview with Evan Solomon for the CTV show Power Play the other day. And the question was, did we act quickly enough? And I said, Evan, you know, I went back and looked. I went through my calendar for the last time I'd been on Power Play, where we were sitting next to each other. There was no social distancing. It was February 18th. The topic of the conversation was COVID-19. And I repeated what I thought, it's exactly what I heard from Dr. Teresa Tam, our Chief Public Health Officer. And the advice was, you can't pick this up from surfaces. I repeated it. And obviously that's not true.
Yeah.
At the time I said it, so I'm looking at it and thinking, am I going to take a partisan shot at Justin Trudeau right now, or Patty Hyju, the Minister of Health, that we didn't act quickly enough? What I think we did was we listened to the best public health advice we could get. Now, our public health officer was listening to the best public health advice she could get. We have bacteriological labs in Canada that are top of the line, and we have the World Health Organization, and we have the US Center for Disease Control. Every lab around the world was trying to figure out what is this, right? Coronavirus, we say, okay, so this is, you know, the scientists say it's a novel virus. Well, okay, it's brand new. We don't know what it does. Now, we could have immediately said, everybody go home, we're shutting down. So I think I would not criticize the steps taken by our government. I think we acted on the best advice we had. I think you can't go wrong as publicly elected people who aren't scientists to say, we have to listen to our top scientists. I'd say the same thing about the climate crisis. We haven't yet listened to our top scientists when it comes to climate. What's interesting to me is, look, everybody, when our government listens to the science and acts based on the science, well, we're all following our instructions, I hope. We're keeping it social distance. We're prepared to do this for as long as it takes to save lives. That's job one for any government, save lives. Let's see how we come out the other side of this. I think where you can criticize, for instance, the United States, and it's not a partisan comment, but it was very clear that Donald Trump did not want to listen to the scientists. He wanted to say the scientists were fake news. He didn't like the idea of basically taking an economic hit, fewer people in his hotels, right? Like this is something he didn't want to accept. So he rejected the science until it became overwhelming. I just pray to God that the situation in the US isn't, I look at New York City right now and the death toll. I mean, we have to hope and pray for the world. We can't be selfish and just say we hope and pray that Canadian lives are spared. We have to pray that all lives are spared, that people get through this, that people show, you know, that we succeed with a vaccine sooner than later, because we now know.
I had a gentleman on from that had just recently come back from Africa, and he was talking about how the infection was exploding in Africa, and that, you know, Africa didn't have the public health and or the hospitals, and, you know, they had no chance to get masks, personal protective equipment, ventilators or anything. And he was saying that this, you know, is going to be far, far worse in the third world than it is in the Western world.
That's why it's been a shock. I mean, Italy, Spain, advanced healthcare systems, the UK. These are industrialized countries with capacity. I mean, you can look at the Italian government traditionally and say, oh my gosh, that's a kind of a crazy form of democracy they got there. But I mean, Italy is an industrialized society that has a good healthcare system, and they were overwhelmed. The U.S. New York City is overwhelmed. We have a very good, robust healthcare system. The key here is that it not be overwhelmed, that we're able to stay home, stick to the rules, keep our social distance, not take chances.
Now, right now, our numbers are on a per capita basis significantly lower than the United States, and that may be because New York is the epicenter, and you know the rest of North America hasn't caught up. But if you take a look at the current numbers, we should be, given population, about 1/10 the United States. We're significantly under 1/10 the numbers in both infections as well as, thankfully, deaths. Do you think that's something that you know we're gonna catch up in Canada, or are we doing something right in Canada?
We're doing something right, and whether we hang on to this and keep our numbers low is entirely dependent on all of us. So it's never been an act of patriotism. I'm going to stay on my couch. I don't know if you saw the other day, Larry David, somebody they broadcasted on the CTV News, that guy from Curb Your Enthusiasm saying, I'm calling on everyone, stay home, watch TV. But it's harder than it sounds. And we all know this. We want to go see friends. The one thing I did that was relaxing and fun in the last 3 weeks was we planned a family Zoom meeting so I could see my grandkids. So I've got grandkids in Vancouver, in Toronto, and in the area outside Halliburton. My daughter and her partner are in Vancouver. And we're going to do another family Zoom meeting because my husband and my new stepkids and we're doing a family Zoom meeting. So Sunday afternoons are kind of a time I've grabbed for seeing the faces. But I want to hug everybody. And so it's not as easy as it sounds for any of us. But I urge Canadians to believe the public health authorities, and I think we do. As long as we have to stay home is what we have to do. I will have to go back to Parliament at some point, it looks like. And I'll be very, 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 very careful making my way across the country.
I can imagine.
I have one coveted stash of disinfectant wipes that I will be using, and I'll wear a mask on. But goodness knows, I think our government, and I said this in Parliament the day that we adjourned, and it was by unanimous consent that we adjourned till April 20th, which at that time seemed like, wow,
a long way away.
Well, I don't think we're going back April 20th, obviously, but that hasn't been officially decided yet. But I said in the House, I was so grateful to be Canadian, where we have a government that doesn't seem to make up the science as we go along. And I will give full marks to, as I said, the civil service, Justin Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland, Patty Hajdu, and the people in Foreign Affairs Canada, who, as far as I can see, are working around the clock to get Canadians home. Every single country posed a different challenge and still poses a different challenge. I mean, they did lockdown. It's obvious. Lockdown in Peru meant that the constituents I had who were in a remote location couldn't travel overland to Lima. So even if our government got a plane to Lima, they also had to negotiate almost person by person by person, get a bus to this town to pick up those Canadians, to get them to Lima, and the same thing with India. It's in lockdown. And so I've got a constituent, a 2-day trip outside of Delhi. She has to get permission from the local police to travel. I mean, every single one of these cases is heart-wrenching for me. Anyway, I can't fault our government. We could say,
well, let me challenge you. Let me challenge you if I could. So, the lockdown in Peru, Lima, obviously terrible for Canadians that are trying to get out. But if you take a look at the graphs that we've all been looking at incessantly for the last couple of weeks, South Korea has got an unbelievably flat graph. And people have commented about how major urban environments are the most challenging because we're all living close together and the infection is more easily spread. But Singapore, Hong Kong have got very flat graphs. And so what they did is they locked people down. South Korea had drones that were flying the streets, surveilling whether people got together, and were telling them to go home and taking pictures of them to report them in. South Korea, China, Saudi Arabia supposedly are using, GPS bracelets on people that are infected and/or apps in South Korea. Diane Francis, columnist at the National Post, who is usually thought of as a right-wing commentator, came out saying we're just not doing enough to save
Yeah.
our people. Do you think we're doing enough?
Well, I don't think you can ever do enough. I mean, let's face it. Right now, I'm really concerned about the financial side. The supports that we have are leaving a lot of people falling through the cracks. That's really, I'm getting a lot. I mean, my constituents are suffering, where a lot of us are saying to the Department of Finance, why are you insisting that no one have had any income for the last 14 days? What about people who had, like, constituents who are part-time healthcare workers, but had another part-time contract, and the part-time contract that's not health related is disappeared, so they can't make their rent, but they don't qualify for this emergency benefit, and they don't qualify for EI. So we still have a lot of work to do. I mean, I'm not going to say that I'll never be critical of what our government's done. I mean, I've got a friend who lives in Taipei, another place, Taiwan, very flat lines. And they early on said everybody has to wear a mask. That remains very controversial. But what I would say is that where we're going to turn out, as you said, so far, it looks like we're flattening the curve, but it's too soon to say. So I think that there will be an analysis afterwards if we could have done more and faster. And there's never a time that that I won't have, be prepared to criticize the government. I just feel like now's not that time.
Now's not the time.
Yeah.
Well, given that now's not the time, we're going to take a break for messages and come back with more Elizabeth May. And I'm going to turn, if it's okay, Ms. May, to the economy in the next segment. So let's take a break and come back with Elizabeth May in just a second. Stay with us. Hello and welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. We're with Elizabeth May, the leader of the Green Party, coming to us from the West Coast. And Ms. May, you were just saying that you were very disturbed with Donald Trump's, what did Donald Trump do that bothered you so much?
Well, this of course, by the time I'm not sure exactly when your viewers will be watching this and listening, but today, with April 4th, April 3rd, rather, Friday, April 3rd, learning that Donald Trump has instructed 3M, the manufacturer, not to send any more of the N95 protective masks to Canada. Our healthcare workers need those. We need them. And 3M is pushing back on the Trump administration and saying there's humanitarian impacts to that decision. Obviously, Prime Minister Trudeau is in negotiations with the U.S. to get them to see that this is not the kind of move you expect from a neighbor. Obviously, though, it again flags that the U.S. is unprepared, that they don't have the equipment that they'd be prepared to say no to us. Now, we happened through my colleague Paul Manley in Parliament. He has a distributor in his constituency of Nanaimo Ladysmith with contacts in China, so we may be able to assist in getting more supply coming in from elsewhere. It's just a really bad sign when the President of the United States would do such a thing. It's hard to imagine. Oh, by the way, I should correct Brian. One thing is that I'm leader of the Green Party in Parliament, but I'm no longer the national leader of the Green Party because our interim leader is Joanne Roberts, and we're in the middle of a leadership contest, which is another whole thing because how can you really have a leadership contest in this pandemic? Our convention is planned for the first weekend in October, and we'll see what happens with that. But anyway, I'm still the leader of the Greens in Parliament of our caucus. And so, yeah.
I apologize. I still see you as the leader of the Green Party, and probably like a
Thank
lot
you.
of Canadians always will.
Well, thank you. I'm not going anywhere, and that in politics, usually by the time you stop being leader, it's because you've either got knives in your back or you're heading out the door. And I'm doing neither, right? I want to stay in Parliament, support the next leader, whoever it will be. I've got Paul Manley and Jenica Atwin and I, even though we're only 3 MPs in the Green Party, we do the work. I think we do the work of any of the bigger caucuses, and we keep up, and we're workers. So we'll see how things look when we get out the other side of this pandemic, where the Conservative Party has its leadership race right now, and Greens have theirs. It feels pretty trivial compared to what we're really dealing with.
Well, and it's interesting that the Conservative Party has postponed or delayed their leadership convention, and so far it would appear the Democratic Party in the United States has not. And I hope the election in November in the United States is not in any way, shape, or form delayed.
Yeah.
But it is, it's fascinating to me that, you've seen town halls with Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders on TV, and we haven't seen that in Canada with the Conservative Party. I guess it's got something to do with this Team Canada attitude, or your attitude of now's not the time to criticize. But let me actually, you comment about President Trump closing the border. It's been fascinating to me how you've seen on American TV governors complaining about governors bidding against governors and governors bidding against the national government. And we have obviously a different healthcare system in Canada, but we also have a different procurement system in Canada, where my understanding is we do not have premiers bidding against each other, that we actually prioritize where goods need to go. And effectively, that's what Governor Cuomo is suggesting we need to have in New York State, if not across the nation in the United States. This has been probably one of the most interesting case studies of how the Canadian healthcare system is better and more prepared than the American healthcare system, is it not?
I was impressed that Health Minister Patty Hajdu actually admitted that we weren't as prepared as we should have been. That's something to admit in the middle of a crisis. I mean, from the SARS epidemic, if you go back to the SARS pandemic, we had a lot of public health advice. And when you've got the memory of it fairly recently in your mind, everybody keeps up with the advice. It's clear that some of the devices that should have been set aside, the access to enough, now we call personal protective equipment, the PPE, wasn't adequate. And it wasn't up to the standard of what had been recommended when SARS ended. And so some of that is provincial and some of that is federal, and it has to fall on all of us to say that when this is over, we don't let pandemics fall off our radar again. Yeah. We have to stay on top of it. But it is, our healthcare system is, as we know, universal and accessible. That's not the case in the US. But I do think that the supplies, we may still have to look at the Emergencies Act. I look at the Emergencies Act, which used to be called the War Measures Act. It's not the War Measures Act of old, but it would allow, which we still can't do. We right now have the sharing of equipment and things go where they're needed by federal provincial cooperation, but we don't have any one brain trust that says, okay, we need to get ventilators right now to Quebec, or we need to get masks right now to Alberta. In the Emergencies Act, under the public health emergency, there could be, through the Minister of Health, the coordination of what the priorities are determined from one central hotspot. We may still need to do that, but you're right. So far, unlike the US, it doesn't feel like governors bidding, premiers aren't complaining that they're bidding against other premiers on eBay. But this is the United States, I think this is going to reveal, as it does for Canada too, fractures in our system. It makes social inequity, it brings into sharper relief. Okay, if you tell people to self-isolate and wash your hands all the time, what does that mean for the homeless population? Yeah. Where are you supposed to go? Where do you find a place to wash your hands? My local community has virtually no homeless people. We're very blessed where we are in Sydney. I mean, Victoria has a very large homeless population, not far away. But our local community just decided that the play park area with its showers and so on is now going to be open with free toiletries available to any population that doesn't have their own home. So everybody, I think, is trying to, well, I hope everybody is trying to figure out, what do we do for the food banks? What do we do for the homeless shelters? Have had to evict half the people who are often in them because of social distancing. Well, where are the new homeless shelters for the people who have nowhere to go? So even within Canada, and certainly for First Nations communities, they've gone into lockdown, but there are still big questions. Why are some of these work camps on Indigenous territory still constructing pipelines, still working on dam construction? We've had COVID-19 cases in those work camps, and the Indigenous people next door are saying, we feel vulnerable. Our biggest risk of an epidemic here, we have to, and we know this, just like when we talk about Africa, we have to know that in Indigenous communities, their healthcare system and access to healthcare is not as good as it is in larger communities that are settler culture. So we've got inequities here in Canada that are going to come up to the surface too. And the economics of this, I think our ability to make sure everybody was okay and could make their rent every month, I think we're going to have to look at guaranteed livable income as a basic part of our social safety net from now into the future, because this patchwork that we're trying to create on the fly in an emergency isn't covering everyone the way it should.
Yeah, well, with a 75% wage subsidy is effectively a guaranteed annual income when you think about it,
It would,
albeit
yeah,
it's only applied via companies, not directly to people.
yeah, and it's tricky too, because I've got businesses in my riding saying, I'm not gonna qualify for it because we haven't lost 30% of our income. What if you lost 25% of your income? Are you still saying a small business that loses a quarter of its revenue can afford to keep every employee on? And if you have to both be 30% of your income down and 30% revenue down, and you have to have already paid all of your employees 75% of their salaries, and then you're going to get paid back. Now, for some companies, that's a hill too steep for them to climb.
Yeah.
For the individuals, I thought initially this is intended to cover everyone. Good, this is good. It'd be like guaranteed annual income that we're going to have. You've had to have made $5,000 last year, and you're going to get $2,000 a month for 4 months, no questions asked. And then the rules started getting like tighter. So no, you have to have no income for the last 14 days, zero. So for a lot of people who aren't making ends meet, or if you didn't make $5,000 last year because you're a student and you're looking at getting your first summer job, where are you going to, so there's a lot of holes here. Foreign students, we're saying to foreign students, you have a right to stay in Canada. You're a foreign student, and you may have a work permit, but you're not going to find a job, and you don't qualify for any income supports right now. So the need for a guaranteed livable income to make sure that we're not, trying to figure out, okay, where's there a hole? Oh, we better plug that hole. Let's just make sure we know what we're doing as a country. A guaranteed livable income is going to be important as Greens, what we were saying in the election campaign, is if you look at the impact on work life for Canadians of artificial intelligence and automation. We're going to be having a lot of people where we're going to have sectors that are increasingly jobless, but we have to figure that out. Bill Gates has talked about it. He talked about having a robot tax, and there's going to have to be a way that the work that's being done, if it's done by artificial intelligence, doesn't pull work away from human beings without putting in its place a way to keep on at least avoiding poverty. So it's a big conversation to have when this is over.
No question. But it's a conversation we got to have right now as well. The report that I saw today was suggesting this is the biggest slowdown in Canadian history since World War II, that we could have a 25% reduction in GDP during Q2. That we may bounce back, but how we bounce back depends on fiscal stimulus, depends on whether companies actually can keep their employees and so therefore can get back on stream quickly, and whether it's a U, V, or L-shaped recovery. And coming out of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, 2010, we had an L-shaped recovery in a lot of ways. What do you, obviously guaranteed annual income is one of those policies, but what do you think of what the government has done so far, and what do you think we need to do?
Well, I'm sure what they've done so far, as I was just saying, there's holes in what they're doing, and it's that legislation that they brought forward in, we were sitting in Parliament March 24th, which was the Tuesday, and it wasn't, I was there virtually through Jenica Atwin, who drove from Fredericton so that they could self-isolate as they drove. So she's fantastic, and I'm so glad we had an MP who could get to Parliament without taking flights. But when I read the legislation, which they sent us on a Sunday, assuming they could get unanimous consent on Tuesday, it was a pretty good example of how stuff that you're trying to do during an emergency on the fly, it's not the best way to legislate. That bill was unacceptable. Just absolutely unacceptable. And, I think that in looking at the mistakes that are being made, and there are mistakes being made, and I know the Minister of Finance, Bill Morneau, and his team are trying as hard as they can, but running to catch up with this kind of economic impact, which nobody could have imagined. I mean, I couldn't have imagined the governor of the Bank of Canada saying, okay, we're going to drop our interest rates and we're going to do this. And by the way, you never criticize a fireman for using too much water. The economic policies and the fiscal policies that are coming out of the Bank of Canada would have been unimaginable even 3 months ago. So
well, and economic strategies that weren't done in the Great Recession. So, they did they did monetary policy, lower interest rates, but they haven't done quantitative easing before. This is something that's imported from the Fed in the United States.
Yeah, well, we did a certain amount of quantitative easing in when Jim Flaherty was Minister of Finance, and he used it to an extent. You got to use what you've got. But the recovery, let's talk about the recovery. Is it going to be out? Yeah, let's hope for this taking off like a rocket. To do that, I think we really need to bring back in a discussion on policies that align with survival in terms of the climate emergency. We need to put money in our future. So, I mean, let's face it, the fossil fuel industry is a sunset industry right now.
Right.
The Russian-Saudi price war is another whole factor, which doesn't really have to do with COVID-19, although COVID-19 made the impacts of the Saudis opening up the taps to keep, so there's a glut of oil in the world. There's no place to store the bitumen in Alberta that nobody wants to buy because it's a very low value product. It's a solid. It can't compete at a price point or at utility. You buy Saudi oil and it's immediately ready to go into a refinery. You buy a barrel of bitumen and you have to have an expensive upgrading process before you can even refine it. So there's a lot going on here for the fossil fuel industry in terms of what the Saudis are doing to the price. Unconventional oil like US Bakken shale, and let's face it, Bakken shale is the main target of the Saudi-Russian action right now. They're trying to make the companies that produce Bakken shale go bankrupt. The Saudis and the Russians want to squeeze the US out of the market. And frankly, Bakken shale is about the foulest of the foul of fossil fuels. It's what blew up, by the way, in Lac Mégantic. You couldn't get bitumen to blow up if you tried. It's a solid, it's virtually inert, it doesn't blow up. But Bakken shale is highly volatile, as we experienced in Lac Mégantic. And it also, like anything fracked, fracking for natural gas and fracking for oil produces a huge volume of greenhouse gases in methane. Yeah. And methane emissions are also, of course, very powerful greenhouse gases.
Well, so, something, 8 to 10 times worse than...
Actually, they're now saying up to 80 times worse.
Oh my gosh.
But it's short term. So the carbon dioxide that comes out the tailpipe if we drive to work, that's with us in the atmosphere for 100 years. The methane, which is 80 times more powerful, is shorter lived and is probably gone within 15 years. But the impact in the short term is far more powerful. So you weigh these things out, and the scientists measure all greenhouse gases and what they call carbon dioxide equivalents. But they've been watching this methane explosion and then realizing, gosh, those Bakken shale fields, the fracking for natural gas in Canada, this has had a much bigger impact on global warming than people realized. So you take all that together and, between price wars, the climate crisis, and the accessibility of renewables, the revolution that's happening in how we get around. Electric vehicles are dropping in price and we are seeing more chargers everywhere. We could do much more with that. So if you look at where would we want to see the investment happening to bring our economy back? I think we've got to be looking a lot at the public sphere, just as they did, FDR and the New Deal was looking at stimulus coming from government. Yeah. Harper did the same thing, stimulus coming from government, 2008. We're going to be having to look at big investments in our infrastructure, and they're long overdue.
And they've got to be big investments in infrastructure that's clean, would be your argument.
Exactly. So fantastic. Electrification of our vehicle fleet, electrification of our bus fleet, And it's not, I mean, we have companies in Canada that manufacture electric buses. So far, Edmonton, ironically, Alberta, Edmonton is in the lead for ordering electric buses. They've ordered 40 electric buses about a year ago. They want to electrify their whole city bus fleet. School buses, that's an ideal place for electric because our school buses are mostly running on diesel.
Yeah.
And there's an acute, immediate respiratory threat to our children as they're shorter, their volume, their body, as they breathe in pollution, it has a much bigger impact because their lung capacity, the size of their body, so they are particularly vulnerable. And there's a lot of health evidence that children absorbing diesel fumes has an impact on their health that's disproportionately larger than if it was us and our full adult
Well,
weight.
I got to tell you, I completely agree with you. I think that investment in clean infrastructure and big public infrastructure is the solution that we've got to count on the federal parliament to come forward with. We're going to take a break.
I'm going to say we have to throw money at the Alberta economy, but let's focus on cleaning up there are 100,000 abandoned deep oil wells in Alberta. The government's talked about helping them clean up. Let's do that.
We're going to take a break and come back for some final comments with Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party in Parliament, in just a minute. Stay with us.
Hi, Brian.
Well, welcome back to a fascinating conversation. I tell you, Elizabeth May, it's an incredible honor and pleasure for me to chat with you this evening in regards to, everything that's going on in the country, both climate change issues as well as obviously COVID-19. And I got to tell you that I've admired you for numerous years. I think that I've always said that climate change is the test for our generation. Frankly, I think now COVID-19 is the test for our generation, and maybe we've got two tests, and how we deal with this one is going to be a good, hopeful example for how we deal with the upcoming one. But let me ask you a final question, if I could, because I think that I actually had Steve Orsini on my show. Steve Orsini was the principal secretary to the cabinet in Ontario, so the top civil servant in Ontario, and he said that there's no better time than an emergency to see whether political leaders have got the chops, that they've got the abilities. I'm a political junkie. I've been a student of politics for a long period of time. I've been extremely impressed with, for an example, Governor Chris Cuomo. Sorry, that's wrong. Chris Cuomo is the Andrew Cuomo. Chris Cuomo is his brother from New York, who's been frank and honest and detailed. I've been very impressed with Tony Fauci, the head of the infectious disease in the United States. I think our head of infectious disease has been quite impressive. I have been unbelievably unimpressed with the President of the United States. I have been impressed with Prime Minister Trudeau. And I have not been in the past supportive of the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, but he is someone who I didn't think listened to scientists, who is now listening to scientists. What's your assessment of our political leadership?
I've got to say, I feel the same way about Premier Ford. His handling of this, he's been relying on his public health advice. He's been and I think the fact that every single day, the leadership in Canada stands up and tells people this is what's going on today, and the person at their right hand every time is their public health officer, from Newfoundland and Labrador right through to BC. And it was really Bonnie Henry, our public health officer, who, because we started dealing with COVID-19 in BC a couple of weeks maybe ahead of some of the other provinces and territories. I can't fault anybody. I particularly think Doug Ford is the big surprise, because for a lot of us, we thought, well, he's kind of in the Donald Trump camp. No, he stands apart. He's Canadian. And all of us have, and as a political class, we're taking our instructions from our public health officers. I have to say, Donald Trump is reckless, potentially in his actions in this crisis, potentially criminal, because to tell people it's fake news, ignore it. I mean, we all looked in horror at those beach scenes from Florida when we are already practicing social distancing in Canada. and we're looking south of the border and thinking, how can they? Well, if the president says, don't worry, you can't blame the individuals. And when it was just not that long ago that Trump was saying, I think this will be over by Easter, packed churches for Easter. Now that's a dangerous image. I'm a practicing Christian. I want nothing as much right now as to imagine that I could go to church on Easter.
Okay. So the governor of Florida has excluded churches from essential and said they're an essential service so that the churches can be open this Sunday, Palm Sunday, as well as Easter Sunday, and supposedly under pressure from evangelical ministers. If you were in the legislature or whatever it's called in Florida, what would you say to that governor?
Read your scripture, you idiot. I don't know what I would say. I mean, we are not called upon as Christians to be reckless and ignore when we need to keep our distance. I mean, this is not a joke. And Passover's coming up. Family seders are going to be very different. Easter's coming up. We cannot gather. We can mark the most sacred of Christian days in our hearts and in our families, but to say that you want people to gather and expand a pandemic and cause the deaths of others through your recklessness. There are people who are, one of the things about being a Christian in a secular society is I should always do a ring fence around this and say, look, the Green Party is welcoming for all faiths, and atheists are welcome. And goodness knows my husband is Buddhist and atheist. My daughter is atheist. I'm not one of these people who's going to be, a lot of people think that because the Christian right is so out there, that if you say you're a Christian, you must automatically be, willing to ignore science. No, there are 2,000 different denominations that are Christian. And for goodness sake, look at Pope Francis, who's in the lead in calling for climate action and is keeping St. Peter's Square empty on Easter Sunday. There are a few, and so I think for viewers and listeners who aren't of any faith at all, or are, this is an abomination. So when I say read your scripture, I mean really. I
go to a local United Church in Mississauga, and my minister is doing preaching from the pulpit via Zoom to all of the members of the church that want to join in. There's no excuse for the celebration of ignorance and claiming that you're doing it in Jesus's name. It's an abomination. Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party in Parliament, I really appreciate you joining me tonight. Do you have any final words of encouragement, message for Canadians? Well, thank goodness we're here, and I hope you're all home safe. I hope you hang on to all the rules. If you're cooped up with your kids and they want to go to school, figure out what you're going to do to keep them busy and online learning, and whatever you can do to keep yourself motivated, keep a strong sense that you're doing the right thing by practicing these social distancing rules. And when we get out the other side of this, I think there's some lessons to remember, which is that governments can act when they take the science seriously. We're going to have to do that around the climate emergency. The pandemic, COVID-19 and climate, between the two of them, climate crisis is a much bigger threat to public health, but it's slower moving. So let's learn the lessons of what we did here and figure out how, when we reboot our economy to get people back to work, we've shifted our economy to one that's going to maintain a healthy living biosphere. Well, Elizabeth May, thank you so much. That's the Brian Crombie Radio Hour for this evening. Come and join us every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. Thank you, Elizabeth.